vBrownbag session at VeeamOn Conference 2015. I'm Simon Perriman with Five9 Software, and I'm here with Dave Kawula, and we're going to be talking about some best practices around virtualization security, how to hack it, how to avoid it, and how to defend your infrastructure. Well, Dave, why don't you quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Simon. My name is Dave Kawula. I'm Senior Technical Evangelist for Five9 Software, Hyper-V MVP. And how about yourself, Simon?
Oh, I'm also with Five9 Software. I'm running our business development and marketing teams. Hyper-V MVP as well, very recently. And prior to that, I spent about 8 years with Microsoft. So I kind of split my time on the engineering team, technical evangelism team, and now I'm here to go train you about all different types of security best practices for virtualization.
So Simon, why are we here today? Like, what's the context of this session that we have?
Well, the big thing is a lot of people don't realize that virtualization is very different. The way you manage your infrastructure, the way you operate it, the way you scale it. And so security kind of has to be treated differently as well. And so what we're trying to do here is educate our Veeam customers about all of these best practices around security.
Yeah.
You know, Veeam's all about backup, right? Protecting the infrastructure. And security, it's not quite the same as backup, but it's certainly a related part, right? It's hardening your infrastructure, protecting it, making it more reliable.
It's a huge part of the infrastructure, right? So we're going to go through a series of kind of questions that we've seen from the field.
Yep.
And we're going to talk about those in this session here. So I guess the first question that we have is, are the security best practices that we're going to discuss applicable to just Hyper-V, or is it for other platforms as well?
Great question. Well, Five9 Software, we only build solutions for Hyper-V, so a lot of people assume that what we're talking about is Hyper-V only. But that's not true. You know, whether you're using VMware, any of the other third-party hypervisors, or Hyper-V, it really is the same. You know, virtualization is the same concept, the same way you run and operate a system. So all of these best practices are absolutely applicable to any virtualization platform.
Awesome. So the second question that we have here is, why is security for virtualization different than traditional data center security?
Well, traditional data center security, we like to call that endpoint security. That's where you actually go and install an agent or a component on every single server or every single system. Now, if you kind of think about data centers in the past where you maybe had 20 servers and you just had 20 servers, right? Yep. Maybe you had 1 or 2 a year. Adding an agent to each of them really wasn't a big deal, right? You knew exactly what you were managing. But if you kind of think about virtualized environments, they change a lot. VMs are suddenly being started and stopped. They might be offline for a while. They might be cloned. There might be third-party people renting a VM and using it in your data center. So really the biggest thing is virtualization is dynamic. You constantly have these things changing. So having to go to a single system and always guarantee locking it down, it doesn't really work anymore.
Well, and then having agents inside of all of those VMs creates a lot of additional complexity in those environments as well, right?
I mean, you've got to install it, right? I mean, anytime you have to go and install something in a VM, somebody needs to log in. Now, if you think about like a service provider, right? You have these administrators, you have the customers. Your service provider shouldn't have access to the guest operating system, but if they need to go and install an agent, they're going to need that. So actually, agent-based installation actually breaks a lot of the kind of privacy best practices and compliance regulations out there too.
Absolutely. All right. Okay, so when we look at virtualization, Simon, what are the most common types of exploits that we'll see inside of the data centers? Like, what does that attack surface look like?
Probably the biggest ones that we see are denial of resources, whether that's denial of service for a web application, denial of memory because there's a particular application that's trying to suck it all in, denial of network access, there's something flooding your network, denial of storage access. You know, most virtualized environments use some type of shared storage for high availability, and if you're blocking access to that storage path, it can't read its data, it slows everything down. So denial is probably the #1 thing we see. And then probably beyond that is what we call advanced persistent threats, APTs. And that's this whole new class of vulnerabilities that are kind of intelligent. They'll try to actually spoof users, they'll specifically attack different types of architecture. So it's really kind of taking these brute force attacks to the next level and specifically targeting your VMware or your Hyper-V infrastructure.
So I think along that line, we really have to think about how we protect those virtual environments. And, you know, having a MAC address that can be changed, or having an IP address that can be changed easily by an end administrator can cause problems from us from a security standpoint. So are there good solutions that are out there that we can have to deal with that?
Absolutely. I mean, regardless of whether you're on any virtualization platform, there are vendors that do specifically build security solutions for virtualization. You know, Five9, we do unique stuff with Hyper-V. There's certainly a lot out there with VMware that will go and integrate with vShield. Catbird, we hear closely compared to our own technologies very often. So there absolutely are companies that just specifically go and protect those vulnerabilities just for virtualization.
Awesome. All right, so now kind of changing gears a little bit around, compliance and, regulatory policies and, why this is important for companies that run virtualization. Is this a big trend that you're seeing out there today that, this is a big concern for CIOs and people like that in industry?
Increasingly so. If you kind of think about regulatory things 5 to 10 years ago, and you think of the big things like HIPAA, SOX, PCI, right? In traditional data centers, they just said protect the data center. But now the whole world's kind of evolving, right? Everyone's virtualizing. I hear statistics that range 75% of all servers are virtualized. That's pretty significant if you really think about it.
Especially from a few years ago, right?
From a few years ago. And because of that, compliance and regulatory people, they've realized that security has to be treated differently. So what you're now going to find is most of the most recent updates do have specific rules and regulations about how to handle virtualized environments and how to handle, cloud-based environments, which obviously use virtualization as kind of the back-end key requirement there too.
So it's kind of moving beyond just having that check mark saying, you have a point solution that can do that. You have to actually make sure that you're really protecting those environments
as well. You have to be conscious that you're virtualizing and have all those different considerations into play as well. Absolutely.
Absolutely. All right, so this is kind of one that's near and dear to my heart, is that, are bad guys out there in the infrastructure, and bad guys can mean a lot of things, Simon. Are they really targeting virtual environments? Are we seeing this kind of on a daily basis today?
Well, I guess the first thing I always remind people about is hacking today aren't high school kids like trying to, post a dirty picture on a website, right? Hacking is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's nation states, it's organized crime.
Yep.
And what we see is people taking stolen credit cards, going and renting out other hardware, renting out hardware from Azure or from AWS, one of these cloud providers, and then specifically attacking other people through that virtualized infrastructure. So it is absolutely, commonplace now. And the fact that so many infrastructures are virtualized and that VMware and Hyper-V, they do have exploits in them. The bad guys know about them. They really are trying to specifically target them. Well, so, we always recommend get a security solution that is specifically virtualization conscious, specifically designed for that.
Well, and us as Hyper-V MVPs, it's really important, and this is really not unique to Hyper-V, but make sure that you're patching your host servers, make sure that you're keeping those up to date. But beyond that, you've got to take a look at the deep nested security solutions that are required to run your enterprise as well.
I mean, it's multiple tiers, right? It's not just like install it on one thing and forget about it.
Exactly.
You protect the perimeter networks, you protect the physical infrastructure, and work your way all the way up to the stack. And when you hit that virtualization layer, that's when you kind of have to think about things a little differently.
So, what's the best way to take and potentially secure these virtual environments that are dynamic? They're not static, they're changing a lot. For example, the modern data center that I see today has workloads floating around on it all the time. So what are the best solutions that we can look at to deal with that?
Well, reality is if you're going to do traditional agent-based security, you have to go and deploy the VM first, then go and install the security application. I mean, that is a two-step process. And going through step 2 immediately opens it to vulnerabilities. There are viruses that can be injected in the memory at boot time, at runtime, at first launch. So if you actually have to go with an approach that has an agent, there's always a risk. There's no way you can work around that. Now, you'll see advances like UEFI. It's one of the latest types of BIOS systems that's provided by Hyper-V in their latest generation. They have things that will stop scripts being executed during boot time. So there are certain technologies that are trying to help with that. But really the best practice that we found is actually doing protection before the threat even arrives at the virtual machine. Now, I'll tell you how Five9 does it along with Catbird integrating with vShield. Basically, if you kind of think about how any type of virus is going to arrive in your virtual machine, it's going to go through the network, right? Well, there's two options. Someone could go and plug a thumb drive into the physical system.
Yeah.
We don't do physical security, right? That's up to the armed bodyguards, right?
Physical security is a whole nother beast.
If
somebody's got physical access to your servers, you typically have a lot bigger problems.
They can do a whole lot worse than that too,
That's right?
Just take it out and run.
Yeah.
So you got to worry about that, and we don't do that. But then the other way that a threat can get to your VM is through the network, right? It goes through your host, through the virtual switch, to the virtual machines. Now, if you kind of think about what a network packet is, it kind of contains two different pieces of information. It contains a header, and it contains the data itself. And the way I kind of like to draw an analogy is like a package you get in the mail. You have the address that says where it's going, and then you open it up and you get whatever's inside, right? So the best way to really provide this guaranteed protection in virtualized environments is do the security of the packet level at the network. So when these network packets are actually on their way to the virtual machine, the host will intercept them, it will inspect them, and it will say, is this packet allowed based on the address? Is the packet allowed based on the payload being safe? And so you kind of do inspection before that threat even arrives at the VM, and that's how you can guarantee that that VM gets safe with that automatic and immediate protection.
Awesome. And so how does 5.9 do that today? Like, are we going to integrate at that agent level, or are we going to be agentless for protecting those environments? Hyper-V virtual switch level? How does 5.9 do that today?
Well, that's it, exactly. It's the Hyper-V virtual switch. So Hyper-V has a component known as the vSwitch, and it's basically the routing mechanism that lives on a Hyper-V host and will direct traffic to any one of your virtual machines, or from one VM over to another VM. Now, this switch itself is extensible, and what that means is partners like 5.9 or Cisco or whoever that is, they can actually go and inject their own drivers in the networking stack. So as any type of traffic's going to the VM or leaving the VM, it has to go get filtered. And this is where the filter is that does that logic, that takes a look at the packet, inspects it, and says you're allowed, you're blocked. So basically it's really hooking into a very deep level of the Hyper-V networking stack that allows us to do that protection. And you'll see the same thing over on VMware using vShield, using their extensions as well.
Awesome. So when we take a look at kind of the best practices around securing these virtual environments, stepping away from the network now, protecting them with some active antivirus protection, what are kind of the best practices that you've seen in industry around that today?
So probably the biggest thing that people struggle with antivirus is maintaining them, maintaining the definitions, maintaining the updates. Now, I mean, everybody out there, right? You have a laptop, you see these updates that pop up once a week. Windows Defender, you need to go and install new stuff, right? It's annoying, and that's kind of the traditional experience most people have, where each individual VM owner has to manage and operate their own antivirus, keep it patched, keep it up to date. Reality is people are lazy. People don't care, especially in things like VDI environments where you have a pulled desktop and you use it for 8 hours, throw it away. People never care about security. And now if you're a host or a service provider, you really need to worry about your tenants also not caring about security, disabling things, downloading viruses, allowing your own infrastructure to get infected. So best practice that we really have around antivirus is don't let the end user manage it. Manage all of that centrally. And so a lot of people say, but how can you go and protect a VM if you don't actually have anything in the VM? And that kind of goes back to this concept of the agentless protection. What we're basically doing is we're taking that network packet as it's going up the stack. If it's allowed through our firewall, we can go and open up the data, actually look at what's inside, and we can scan that as it's going to the VM and say, is there a virus in it? Does it match? So that kind of gives us this active detection. So as soon as a virus goes through the network, we can see it, we can alert, and then we can do different remediation actions.
Which is incredibly important because that proactive standpoint that you take in the data center is really important for enterprise administrators today. They don't have time to babysit all of these things.
I mean, it's immediate as well, right? As soon as it goes through the switch, we're doing scans, we detect it, we alert you. So absolutely best practice. And the other tangential thing for that is, if your administrator is now able to centrally manage everything, right, meaning that they can just manage the host and it protects all the VMs, it means they can centrally manage the updates and the signatures to ensure that they're always current, that they're always consistent. So you don't have a VM that's got one security policy, another VM that has a different definition, and just inconsistency across that, So you get that guaranteed consistency with your heuristics, your databases, or your analytics as well.
Awesome. All right, so now that we've looked at antivirus, how about firewalls and virtualization? What are some of the things that our viewers that are watching this episode on the vBrownbag? What are some of the things that they should be concerned about with virtual firewalls? Because there's a lot of flavors of virtual firewalls that are out there today.
There are.
And what do we see in industry, being a security company as 5.9, in relation to firewalls?
So, best practice around firewalls is actually do the firewall protection at the host level rather than actually in the VM itself at the application level.
Oh, really?
And the reason for that is if you kind of think about that network packet that's going through the host, going through the virtual switch, then going to a virtual machine, if we could go and block it and intercept it and do a firewall and a virtual switch, this means we're doing our protection one level before it arrives at the VM. And this gives a lot of advantages. First, you can have a universal firewall. And what I mean by that is it could be completely agnostic of the guest operating system. So that guest OS can be Windows client, Windows
Linux?
server, and Linux and Unix. We don't care.
Oh, really?
And the reason why is we're intercepting that packet before it arrives at the VM. Now, if you're a hoster and you have a diverse environment, right? You have some Hyper-V virtual machines, you have Linux VMs, you have all these different guest operating systems, and maybe your tenants require 5 different flavors of Linux. That's really tough to have a global firewall policy.
Absolutely.
So by having this universal firewall you set at the host level, it's consistent. You could create templates, you could broadly apply that across all your Hyper-V hosts. So again, it kind of goes back to that best practice of the centralized management, right? Not having to go to every single of your 1,000 VMs and configure policies there.
Now, do you have to configure with your 5.9 solution that we have? Do we have to configure that on a per VM basis, or could we group VMs together?
Great question. We could group VMs, and you'll find most security solutions do that. You'll be able to create some type of security template policy, a VM group. You add the VMs that require those same settings to the group, and then you globally apply it. So maybe all your SQL VMs, they require different firewall ports than all of your website VMs, for example, right? So you put all your SQL in one group or your web in a group, and as you deploy more, you clone more, you just put them in the same group, and that way you get that consistency with the policies as well.
Now, I know a lot of hosters that are out there are, building out environments based on Windows Azure Pack and Azure Stack in the future. Does the 5.9 solution accommodate those hosters as well? Are there extensions available for those hosters?
It absolutely does. What we do, we plug into System Center, and that would be kind of equivalent to vCenter, or vSphere actually. And then we also plug into, Azure Pack, which is kind of equivalent to, what would that be, Horizon?
Yeah.
What's the VMware equivalent there? Shame on me, I don't have all my VMware knowledge. I was a VCP a couple years ago, not anymore. But in any case, it's definitely a best practice for these hosters and service providers to have that agentless protection, right? So their end users never have to worry about the security updates. And more importantly, the hoster doesn't need to worry about a bad guy using his VM to go commit a crime, right? Because what you see in these hosted environments is the bad guy will come in with a stolen credit card and he'll rent the VM and he'll do bad things through it, and it makes it look like it was done by the hoster. They dispose the hardware. And the way they do that is they'll just disable security inside the VM, perform the attack.
Yep.
But if there's no security to disable because it's been abstracted, they can't do that, so you can still get that protection.
Or we can start siloing it off if bad things are happening.
Exactly, right.
All right, so we've looked at antivirus, so we've got some protection available for antivirus and some best practices around that in the data center. Looked at firewalls. Now, how about intrusion detection? So some more real-time, proactive, protection in the data center.
Yeah.
So what are kind of best practices that you've seen around that today? Because this is actually one that's really important, because those types of threats that are kind of real-time happening in your data center are going to be ones of most concern to your network and your virtualization administrators.
Absolutely. So I guess first of all, what is IDS? IDS is basically advanced types of threats that are, going to try different types of mechanisms to go and actually attack your infrastructure. The most common type that we see are actually denial of service attacks, DOS or DDoS. Yep. And that's one that most people are familiar with, where you have a website and you have lots and lots of clients all trying to hit that same website at the same time. Now, if you kind of think about what that is, there's actually a traffic pattern behind that. The traffic pattern is you have a single endpoint, you have multiple tenants, and they're sending an exceedingly unusual number of connection requests to that endpoint at the same time. And so if we can actually build algorithms around those types of threats, right, where you could clearly define, here's a standard traffic, here's something unusual, and if we start to see these unusual patterns, we go flag it and say, hey, we think there might be a problem there. So basically intrusion detection are these kind of advanced threats, unusual things, not just brute force, but really trying to go and target a specific type of server infrastructure and things like that. So what are the best practices? Well, you really want to use an IDS solution. Cisco Snort's the most common, the most popular one in the industry. And what that does is you're basically collecting your own logs, you send it to the Cisco Snort engine, and that will actually do the heuristics on it and kind of say, here's the types of patterns we're seeing, this seems unusual, we think you have this type of virus, we're going to alert you. So For smaller companies, IDS probably isn't used very commonly, but large companies, I mean, you really need an IDS solution to have intrusion detection, and in some cases even take that a step further and have an IPS solution, or intrusion prevention.
Well, with Five9 Cloud Security, it's included inside of the product.
That's right,
regardless if you turn it on or not, right?
That's right.
So it's there, it's
available. You
available.
kind of get it for free, along with the different antivirus engines and everything.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so the next one here is that, why is it a good idea to hide security from the end users and centrally manage things? And I think you kind of alluded to this a little bit with one of your statements about somebody coming into the data center hoster's environment, maybe unlocking that administrator account and doing whatever they want inside of the system. And I think that's kind of along the lines of what we're getting at with this point. Right?
Absolutely. Here's kind of what I always remind hosters. Think about what happens to a public park or the back of a taxi cab, right? It's something that's shared that you're renting temporarily. People abuse it. People will graffiti the park. They'll leave garbage in the back of the taxi. They're going to do the same thing for your hosted environment when they rent your VM. They don't care about it. They have no reason to want to go spend that extra 15 minutes to keep it secure. They don't care, it's vulnerable. So you have some users that want to do bad things. You have some users that just don't care about security. It's not their problem. And it is the problem of the administrator though, right? All of your users, they're downloading viruses. You might have a help desk system where people are sending them files. That's one of the most common ways these help desks get attacked. People will say, I have a problem, here's a copy of my file, and it will actually be a virus, And all of these guys are just getting hounded, getting killed by these different attackers in these hosted environments. But what we've done, or what the best practice is that abstraction entirely. Take security out to the VM, put it on the host, so people don't have to worry about it. They don't see it, they don't notice it, they can't disable it, they don't have to worry about it.
So along those lines, offline VMs. What happens with offline VMs, VMs that are actually turned off in a dormant state? Is it a good practice for us to be scanning those as well at the same time?
It's always a good practice to be scanning disks, right? Data, here's kind of one of the challenges that you have with viruses. You could have downloaded a virus a month ago and there wasn't a definition for it yet, right? So your VM could have been there a month ago, you shut it down, you're using it for a different project, you started up a month later, now all of a sudden we know about this virus. It has a definition, we can detect it. So you don't want to have to be in that scenario where something's been offline and you suddenly start it up. You want to be in the scenario where you can still scan it. So whether the VM's online, offline, it's always still a best practice to kind of constantly be updating it, checking it, and scanning it.
All right, so we've looked at some of the ways of securing the data center in many different fashions. Let's change gears a little bit and look at how we can take and control and manage and limit those resources that a particular VM is using. And tell me, Simon, why is this important? Not just to a hoster, but to a virtualization administrator.
Well, the biggest thing is you don't want a single user or a single virtual machine consuming all your resources. And that's basically a denial of resource attack, right? Whether that's denial of memory, network, CPU, disk I/O, whatever that is, right? And so, one of the most common threats is people will have a VM. The VM will have something like dynamic memory or memory ballooning turned on, which basically means that VM can continue to expand its memory until there's no memory left. And so people do take advantage of that Hyper-V and that VMware feature where they'll have a VM and all it does is churn up memory, like a SQL application. And that's just going to slow everything down on the whole system. And that means other users, other VMs on that same host are going to slow down as well. Or they can't access their data, or people can't connect to it through the network. It does become a major problem. So quality of service or throttling, that's the solution for that.
Absolutely.
And basically, you get to set thresholds. Every VM gets at least a minimum amount, and no VM can consume above a maximum amount. And so that way you kind of always keep a VM's network, memory, CPU, or disk I/O within a certain range so everybody gets the resources they need.
It prevents you from having that situation of the runaway VM, right?
Absolutely, yep.
All right, so let's take a look at the next one here. Why did traditional network security appliances fail inside of those virtualization environments?
Biggest answer is they don't see virtual networks. Now, if you kind of think about what a network security appliance is, right? It's a box, it's a device that sits on the physical network. And so it does detect traffic that goes through that physical network. So from one host over to another host, it will scan, it will filter, it will detect problems or IDS or malware, whatever that is. But then if you have to think about a virtualized environment when you have two VMs on a single host, and they're communicating to each other, they go through a private virtual network. That doesn't go external, that doesn't get filtered. And so the big challenge is if one of those VMs gets infected, it can actually infect every other VM on the same host through its own internal networks, the virtual networks, before that external appliance even detects there's a problem. So that's actually a pretty big risk, especially for hosters or people with any type of shared network and shared virtual infrastructure.
Is it also important that when organizations are looking at solutions that directly integrate with the Hyper-V virtual switches, that they be approved and kind of certified by the vendors? For example, Microsoft?
Absolutely. I mean, Microsoft has its own certification program. They actually have several, but Windows Server certification is the most common one you see. And that's where you get the little logo that will actually, you can actually go stick on your product or the box. Why it's important is because it means that the product genuinely is tested. Basically what happens from this ISV side, the software developer side, is you have to go download a bunch of different applications and scripts and tests. You go upload your own application, you run it against all of these different tests, and it looks at things like, do you support IPv6, internationalized domain names, kind of all of these kind of more obscure things that you might not think is kind of your core competency, but the fact is there are people out there that use internationalized domain names and use IPv6. And so you don't want to forget about that. So absolutely best practice, make sure it's certified.
All right, so a couple more here before we're done. I/O storms. How are I/O storms caused inside of virtual environments, and why are they bad?
So what happens with a security storm or a scanning storm is basically you're going and testing every single file on every single disk, on every single VM to see whether it has a virus. And if you're a hoster, if you have a very dense environment, that's lots and lots of files you have to scan, right? And what's basically happening behind the scenes is it's doing these mathematical calculations on the file to try to see if it matches a definition based on your antivirus. And so when you're scanning a large infrastructure, it can really take up to a 30% performance hit. So what does that mean as someone that's running a dense virtualized environment? Well, everything slows down, or you run 30% fewer VMs per host. So that's extremely inefficient. So you really want to have a solution that doesn't really get hit with those scanning storms. Best way to do that is not have the agents, don't have things that are running inside every VM. And so we've done some optimizations with 5.9 with patent pending technologies. We scan about 70 times faster than everyone else in the industry because we don't have to scan every single file every time. We track which files have changed and we only scan the deltas, known as change block tracking.
So very similar to what Veeam uses for their backup solution.
Absolutely right. You don't have to back up 1 terabyte or do a security scan for 1 terabyte every time if only 1 megabyte has changed. Just do the deltas.
So the initial scan will take some time, and then after that it'll be very, very
Absolutely,
quick.
That's right.
All right, Simon, I think that's probably about all the time that we have
That's been
today.
great. Well, thanks for chatting with me, Dave. We certainly hope everybody out there learns some best practices around security, and really most importantly, why security is different for virtualized environments. Don't assume it's the same. Don't do traditional endpoint protection. Make sure that you really are trying to get a solution designed for your own virtualization platform. Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys.